The dust of Abilene, Kansas, tasted of iron and fear. It swirled in the noon sun, clinging to the sweat on Calder Briggs's neck as he stood outside the Merchants Bank, one hand holding his son Daniel's small fingers, the other resting on his wife Sarah's back. They were laughing, Daniel having just pointed out a dog wearing a ridiculous-looking hat, a sight so absurd in the otherwise severe town that even Calder had cracked a smile. Inside his coat pocket, a new silver locket felt heavy and cool, a third anniversary gift for Sarah, engraved with a simple promise. Always. The promise shattered with the bank's front window. Glass exploded outward in a crystalline spray. The laughter died in Calder's throat, replaced by the deafening roar of a shotgun blast. People screamed, scattering like quail. Calder's world narrowed to a single frantic instinct: protect them. He shoved Sarah and Daniel toward the wall of the adjacent dry goods store, shielding them with his body, as three masked men burst from the bank canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. "Move! Get out of the way!" one of them roared, a big man with a wild look in his eyes, the leader. Calder held his family tight, pressing them into the rough-hewn planks of the building. But the street was chaos. A spooked horse reared its wagon, jackknifing across the thoroughfare, blocking the robbers' escape route. The leader, his face contorted with rage, turned and fired his pistol into the air. The crack echoed off the storefronts, sharp and final. That was when the town marshal returned fire from the end of the street. The first bullet whined past Calder's ear. The second found its mark. The leader of the gang staggered, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed to his knees, dropping one of the heavy sacks. The remaining two robbers hesitated for only a second before grabbing the money and running, abandoning their fallen leader. In that frozen moment, as the dust settled around the dying man, Calder felt a strange, chilling stillness. He thought the danger had passed. He loosened his grip on his family, turning his head to whisper, "It's over. It's all right." But it wasn't. The dying robber, Silas Blackwell, was not yet dead. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline and malice, he raised his pistol one last time. He wasn't aiming for the marshal. He wasn't aiming for anyone. He was just a dying animal lashing out at the world that had cornered him. He fired blindly into the crowd. Calder didn't hear the shot so much as feel it, a concussive force that seemed to pass through him. He saw Sarah's eyes widen, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. He saw Daniel flinch against her. Then he saw the red, a horrific bloom of it, on the crisp white fabric of Sarah's dress and another on Daniel's small shoulder. They fell together, a single tangled heap of grace and innocence, their bodies slumping against his. The world went silent. The shouting, the gunfire, the panicked whinnying of horses, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. Calder knelt his knees, hitting the dusty boardwalk with a force he didn't feel. He gathered them into his arms, his hands coming away slick and warm. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Daniel." Sarah's eyes were already glassy, fixed on a sky she could no longer see. Daniel's breath was a faint, shallow flutter. Calder pulled them closer, burying his face in their hair, the scent of lavender and sunshine already fading. He didn't notice the shard of glass that had torn open his own cheek, leaving a deep gash from his temple to his jaw. He didn't feel the pain. Amid the chaos, something silver and heavy slipped from his coat pocket, he noticed. The locket, its promise of always. Now a mockery fell into the dust and was kicked aside by a running boot coming to rest near the outstretched hand of the dead robber. Calder Briggs knelt in the street, holding the impossible weight of his silenced world, and screamed. It was a sound with no words, a sound of a soul being ripped in two. And then there was only the terrible, unending quiet that followed. 8 years later, the wind in Snow Ridge, Wyoming, carried a different kind of silence. It was the vast, empty silence of the high plains, a sound that swallowed a man whole if he let it. Calder Briggs had let it. The wind screamed down from the Bighorn Mountains, tearing through his ranch like a beast with claws of ice. It was November, and the world was turning hard and unforgiving. Eliza Munro stood beneath the sagging awning of an abandoned assayer's office in town. Her boots soaked through her skirts, stiff with a lattice of frost. She had been walking since dawn, a ghost drifting through a town that had already decided she didn't belong. The boarding house matron had thrown her out that morning, her words a final sharp jab. Bad reputations travel fast, girl. We don't need your kind of trouble here. Her hands, red and raw, clutched the edges of her threadbare shawl. The fabric might as well have been paper for all the warmth it offered. Hunger was a familiar companion now, a sharp twisting knot in her stomach. Across the street, the scent of beef stew drifted from the saloon onions, herbs, the thick, impossible promise of warmth. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to shed, and her legs trembled with a weakness that went bone deep. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Well, well. A man's voice slurred thick with whiskey. What do we have here? Eliza turned, her body tensing. He was a trapper by the look of him, his coat worn but lined with fur, his eyes clouded with drink and a casual sort of cruelty. A little thing like you shouldn't be out in this cold. I'm just trying to stay warm, she murmured, her voice a reedy whisper. He grinned a yellowed, predatory expression. I've got a fire, a warm bed, don't mind sharing. She instinctively backed away, pressing herself against the cold brick of the building. Please. No. His smile vanished. You ain't got options, sweetheart. You want food, shelter, you know the price. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. She gasped a jolt of old fear and fresh panic shooting through her. She tried to pull away, but he held fast. I said no. She snapped, her voice shaking but clear. Don't you act better than you are. He sneered, pulling her closer. I believe the lady said no. The new voice cut through the storm low and even edged with something as hard as frozen earth. Both Eliza and the trapper turned. A man stepped forward from the swirling snow, his form a dark silhouette against the whiteout. He was tall and broad-shouldered, snow clinging to the brim of his hat and the collar of his coat. A pale, jagged scar sliced down the left side of his face from temple to jaw, but it was his eyes, impossibly cold, impossibly steady, that made the drunkard pause. This ain't your business, the trapper muttered, though his bravado was already failing. It is now, the stranger said, his voice unchanging. He took another slow step forward. You don't know who she is. I know she's cold, the stranger replied, his gaze unwavering. I know she said no. And I know you didn't listen. The trapper's confidence crumbled completely. She ain't worth the trouble anyway. He let go of Eliza's wrist with a shove and stumbled off down the street, cursing into the wind. Eliza remained pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stranger didn't move. You all right, ma'am? He asked. She could only manage a faint nod, unable to find her voice. I don't know. When's the last time you ate? The simple, direct question undid her. She looked away, shame and exhaustion washing over her. Without another word, he shrugged off his heavy canvas coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was immense, heavy, and smelled of pine leather and the profound life-giving heat of another human being. Wait, she whispered, overwhelmed. I can't. No one should be cold and hungry out here, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Not in this land. He held out a gloved hand. It was a gesture of introduction, not comfort. Calder Briggs. I've got a ranch outside of town. 3 pines. Nothing fancy, but it's dry. If you're willing to work cook clean, I'll give you a room, food, and wages. Fair and honest. Eliza hesitated, her mind racing. She searched his face for any sign of a hidden motive, of the leering cruelty she had come to expect from men. There was nothing. Only a deep, unreadable weariness in his eyes, a sorrow so profound it seemed carved into his features alongside the scar. "Eliza Monroe," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I'll work." He gave a single curt nod. From his pocket he pulled a pair of thick wool gloves and placed them gently in her trembling hands. There were no more speeches, no prying questions, no expectations set. He simply turned and walked toward a waiting wagon at the edge of the street, its outline barely visible through the snow. Eliza looked down at the gloves in her hands and then up at the shelter of his broad back. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and followed. The snow deepened as the wagon rolled out of town, its wheels groaning under the weight of ice and silence. Eliza sat stiffly on the buckboard beside Calder Briggs, his heavy coat a fortress around her. The landscape blurred into an endless expanse of whiteness, pine trees bowing under their heavy burdens, distant mountains like ghosts in the failing light. They said nothing for most of the ride. Only the rhythmic huffing of the horse's breath and the steady creak of the leather harnesses filled the void. "How far?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. 10 miles, he replied, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Less if the road holds. As they climbed higher into the hills, the sky darkened from slate gray to a deep bruised purple. Calder lit the lantern at the front of the wagon, its weak golden glow pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Eliza kept her eyes on the horizon, but her thoughts churned. Who was this man, really? Why take in a stranger without question, without demanding a price? In her experience, every act of kindness came with a hidden ledger, a debt to be paid. Yet Calder Briggs had not stared at her with appraisal in his eyes, had not touched her more than was necessary, had not even asked for her story. His quiet decency was more unsettling than any open aggression. At last, the dark outline of a homestead emerged through the trees. A perimeter of wooden fencing, a large slanted barn, and a 2-story house, with a thin curl of smoke rising valiantly from its chimney. Calder pulled the wagon to a stop. He dismounted with an economy of movement, then turned and offered her a hand to help her down. She hesitated for a heartbeat before taking it. His grip was firm, impersonal, and steady as rock. Inside, the house was filled with a profound quiet. The entryway was lined with worn boots and a simple rack of coats. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped in a lonely sound that the silence swallowed whole. The warmth from a stone hearth washed over Eliza, a physical presence so welcome. It felt like a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Calder gestured toward the stairs. "Up there. Second door on the right." Eliza climbed slowly the old wood, groaning a weary welcome with each step. At the top of the landing, she found the door and pushed it open. She stopped on the threshold, her hand still on the latch. The room was simple, Spartan even, but it was clean, and it was hers. A small bed with a neatly made patchwork quilt sat beneath a window that faced the mountains. A wooden chest stood at its foot. In the corner, a small pot-bellied stove flickered, already lit and radiating a gentle heat. On the windowsill rested a row of books, their spines faded and worn clearly well-loved. She crossed the room and ran her fingers across the quilt. It was soft and smelled faintly of cedar. A lump rose in her throat, fast and hot. She turned away from the comforting sight of the bed, covering her mouth with her hand. But it was too late. Tears came anyway, silent, stinging, and unstoppable. They were tears of relief, so deep they felt like grief. Downstairs, Calder waited. He didn't call up to her, didn't rush her. When she finally descended, her eyes red-rimmed but her face composed, she found him in the kitchen. He was pouring hot water from a kettle into a tin mug. "There's bread," he said, nodding toward a loaf on the counter. "And stew left from last night. Not fancy, but it's warm." Eliza sat at the small wooden table. The chair creaked, protesting her slight weight. She tucked her hands under her arms, ashamed of how they trembled. He set a bowl in front of her. Steam curled upward, carrying the rich, earthy scent of meat and root vegetables. It smelled like thyme and patience, and something that felt dangerously close to comfort. "Thank you," she whispered. He poured tea into a mug and set it beside her bowl, and then sat opposite his own silence, a heavy blanket in the room. As she lifted the spoon to her lips, his gaze fell to her hands, still chapped and cracking from the cold. Self-conscious, she quickly pulled them into her sleeves. "Don't," Calder said, his voice low, but not unkind. She looked up, startled. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small tin, sliding it across the table toward her. The label was faded, but she could make out the words. "Dr. Mason's Healing Salve." Her fingers hovered over the tin, unsure. "Hands like that," he added, his voice gruff, as if the words were uncomfortable in his mouth. "They've still got plenty left to give. To fix things. To make things better." She swallowed past the tightness in her throat. "I was a teacher," she blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was a piece of a life she thought was gone forever. He looked at her, then his gaze direct. "I believe that," he said simply. She nodded, unsure why it mattered so much that he did. The rest of the meal passed in a comfortable silence, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the soft clink of her spoon against the bowl. When she finally stood to go to bed, Calder gave a single nod. "Good night, Miss Monroe." "Eliza," she corrected him softly. He met her eyes for a long moment. "Eliza." She turned and climbed the stairs. In her room, she closed the door, and for the first time in months, the soft click of the latch settling into place was not a sound of imprisonment. It was the sound of a sanctuary. A lock not meant to keep danger out, but to hold a fragile newfound peace in. The days settled into a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm. Each morning, Eliza rose before the sun, wrapping herself in the coat Calder had given her before padding across the cold wooden floor. In the kitchen, she wrestled with the monolithic iron stove, her first attempt at porridge boiling over into a blackened mess, her second batch of biscuits turning out as hard as stones. One morning, while drying dishes, a plate slipped through her numb fingers and shattered across the floor in a cascade of white shards. She gasped, kneeling to gather the pieces, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll fix it, Eliza." Calder was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He came and crouched beside her, picking up a curved piece of china. "Plates break," he said, his voice a low rumble. "So long as people don't, we're still ahead." She looked at him, searching for any hint of mockery or frustration, but found none. He simply took the pieces from her hand and disposed of them. Outside, she learned the simple, hard chores of the ranch. She learned to scatter grain for the chickens without them pecking her ankles raw, to carry 2 full buckets of water from the well without spilling half of it down her front, to rake out the stalls in the barn until her back ached. The cold stung her cheeks, and the wind stole the breath from her lungs, but she kept going. She burned the stew again. Calder ate it without a word of complaint. When she apologized, he only said cold stoves harder to learn than books ever were. His kindness was a quiet, practical thing. When he noticed her thin shoes were soaked through after a morning of chores, a pair of sturdy, waterproof boots appeared by the door the next day. When the stovepipe in the kitchen jammed with soot and filled the room with smoke, he climbed onto the roof in the biting wind and cleared it himself, hammering new shingles into place against the steel-gray sky. One evening, she returned to her room to find a bundle at the foot of her bed, a heavier coat expertly sewn from old wool blankets and lined with flannel. There was no note, no acknowledgement. The gifts simply appeared like offerings left at a shrine. The house remained quiet. Calder a steady, silent presence within it. Yet something in Eliza began to uncoil a knot of fear and tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for so long. One night, a blizzard came howling down from the mountains, slamming into the rafters like an angry fist. Eliza lay awake under her quilt, the wind's mournful cry dredging up memories she had tried so hard to bury. Royce Blackwell's hand on her wrist. The shame in her father's eyes. The accusation, the disbelief, the swift, cold dismissal from the only home she had ever known. She woke with a strangled gasp, her heart pounding the sheets damp with sweat. Her breath came in fast, shallow pants. Moonlight filtered through the storm, poured through the window, casting pale, shifting lines across the wooden floor. She swung her legs out of bed trembling, then froze. At the foot of her door, a thin line of light shone from the hallway. Something had shifted. She stood her bare feet, making no sound on the floorboards as she crossed the room. There on the threshold sat a single mug. Steam curled upward from it, carrying the warm, comforting scent of milk laced with cinnamon. She opened the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty. There were no footsteps, no creaking boards, just the deep, abiding silence of the house and the storm raging outside. She stared at the mug, at the gentle wisp of steam, and felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. Not tears of pain or fear, but of an aching gratitude for a kindness so quiet it asked for nothing in return. She picked it up, wrapping her hands around its warmth, and brought it back inside. As she sipped the sweet hot milk, the storm outside continued to scream its fury. But inside her small room, for the first time, she felt safe. She was not alone. It began with a name whispered at the general store. Eliza had ridden into town with Calder to pick up flour, salt, and kerosene. He left her near the shelves of canned goods while he went to barter with Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, for a better price on horse feed. That was when she heard a fragment of a conversation between two old men warming their hands by the pot-bellied stove. Said he was from back east. Name of Blackwell, I think. Tall fella dressed mighty fine, asking questions. The name struck her like a splash of ice water. Eliza's hand clenched around a sack of flour so tightly her knuckles went white. Blackwell. Royce. The possibility seized her chest, making it hard to breathe. She tried to tell herself it was a coincidence, a different Blackwell, just a traveler passing through. But a cold dread had already taken root in her gut. She knew. She stepped outside into the bitter wind, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. That night, she barely touched her food. Calder noticed his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual, but he didn't ask. He rarely did. The following morning, Sheriff Langley rode up to the house, his horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. "Morning, Briggs," the sheriff said, tipping his hat as Calder met him on the porch. He was a practical, no-nonsense man with weary eyes that had seen too much. "Got a stranger came through town yesterday, asking about a young woman. Said her name was Eliza Monroe. Gave a description. Matches your guest." Calder's jaw tensed, the only outward sign of his reaction. What did he say he wanted? Said she ran off from her family. That she's needed back east for some important family matter, the sheriff explained. Looked official enough, had papers. But there was something off about him. Too smooth. His name was Royce Blackwell. Eliza, who had been listening from just inside the doorway, went as pale as the snow piled against the house. Sheriff Langley glanced past Calder and saw her. His expression softened slightly. "I didn't say nothing, ma'am," he assured her. "Told him if he wanted to find anyone in my county, he'd best have a warrant signed by a Wyoming judge." He rode off toward the foothills. Said he'd be back. He tipped his hat again. "Just thought you should know." When the sheriff had gone, Calder didn't look at her, not yet. He stood staring out at the trail, his back a rigid wall. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, her voice small but clear, Eliza said, "I need to tell you something." He nodded once without turning. "Come inside." She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap, they ached. She kept her eyes fixed on the wood grain as she spoke. "Back in Kansas, I worked for the Blackwell family." She began, her voice low and steady. "They were wealthy, powerful. Royce was the eldest son. I was a tutor for his younger sisters. Reading Latin, a bit of mathematics." She swallowed hard, the memories thick in her throat. "He started paying me attention, bringing me gifts, a brooch, silk gloves. I told him I couldn't accept them, that I wasn't interested. One night he cornered me in the library. He tried to force himself on me. I pushed him away and ran. I told his mother what happened. She didn't believe me. She called me a liar, an opportunist." Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. 2 days later, I was accused of stealing. Jewelry went missing from Mrs. Blackwell's room. They found forged letters in my things, supposedly from me to a lover, detailing a plan to take the jewelry and run. It was his word against mine. Calder's face remained an unreadable mask of stone. "My own father believed him," she said, her voice finally cracking. "He said I had shamed our family. He told me to leave before the scandal ruined my sister's chances of a good marriage." She finally dared to look up at him. Her eyes were brimming with unshed tears, but her voice held firm. "So I ran. I had nothing. No friends, no home. Just my name, and even that was ruined." Calder remained silent for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast, empty landscape. The snow drifted lazily past the glass, each flake a tiny, perfect crystal. "You know," he said slowly, his back still to her, "when I first saw you in that alley, you were shaking. You were hungry and scared to death. But when that man grabbed your wrist, you still said no." He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. "I've watched you gather eggs in a snowstorm with your fingers near frozen. I've seen you burn your hands on the stove and keep on cooking. Every day you rise before dawn. You fix what you break, and you have never once asked for pity." Eliza blinked, feeling as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. "I don't care what they said about you back in Kansas, Eliza," he said, his voice steady as the mountains. "I know who you are." He paused, and his next words were quieter, heavier. "I know who you are when you bend down to feed the hens in the bitter cold, and you think no one is watching." Her lips parted. And then the tears came. Not the hot, bitter tears of shame she had shed in Kansas, or the desperate, lonely tears of her journey west. These were quiet, slow tears of overwhelming relief. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her fingers. "I'm not trying to be a burden." "You don't have to explain." Calder said, his voice low, almost rough with some unspoken emotion. "Not to me." For the first time since she had left her home, Eliza wept, not because she was afraid, but because someone had finally believed her without needing proof. The wind had shifted by late morning, blowing harder and colder from the north. It snapped through the bare branches of the cottonwoods and moaned around the corners of the barn like a prophecy. Eliza stood on the porch, a pail in her hand, her eyes scanning the distant ridgeline. An uneasy feeling had settled over her, a sense of something inevitable approaching. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider. A single horseman moving with an arrogant confidence that ate up the trail. He wore a coat far too fine for the frontier, and he rode as if he owned the land beneath him. It was Royce Blackwell. He reined his horse to a stop at the fence that bordered the yard, not bothering to dismount. He sat there, the reins held loosely in one hand, a folded paper in the other, his presence an ugly stain on the clean white landscape. Calder stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved toward the fence with deliberate, unhurried steps, placing himself squarely between Royce and the house, where Eliza stood frozen on the porch. "Afternoon," Royce called out, his voice as smooth as polished varnish. "I heard you'd settled in nicely, Eliza. It's a cozy little life you've carved out for yourself." Calder didn't respond. His body was a silent, immovable barrier at the gate. "I have legal authority here." Royce continued, holding up the paper. "A writ signed by a magistrate in Dodge City. She's to be remanded to family custody. Mine. She's not going anywhere." Calder said, his voice flat. Royce laughed, a condescending, humorless sound. "You don't get to decide that, rancher." "I do when it's my land, my fence, and my gate." Royce's jaw flexed, a flicker of irritation crossing his handsome features. "She's not who you think she is. That woman is a liar and a thief. She embarrassed my family and humiliated her own. She's a danger to your reputation." As he spoke, he drew a silver pocket watch from his waistcoat, flipping it open with a practiced flick of his thumb. It was an ornate piece, engraved with intricate scroll work. Calder's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of some distant buried memory stirring within him. He couldn't place it. "If you want to talk about reputations," he said calmly, "let's start with what really happened in Kansas. In the library. Let's talk about the theft that never was." Royce's smile slipped. "I suggest you mind your tongue," he said, his voice turning cold. Calder took a step closer to the gate, his boots crunching in the snow. "If you plan on coming through this gate," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch, "you'll have to go through me." Royce's eyes narrowed into slits. Then, with a sudden fluid movement, he dropped the reins, his hand diving inside his coat. He drew a revolver and leveled it at Calder's chest. Eliza gasped, the pail slipping from her numb fingers and crashing against the porch steps with a hollow clang. Calder didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon of his own. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked from the pistol to Royce's eyes. "That gun you're holding," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "Is it meant to bring a woman home? Or to hide what you did to her?" The wind seemed to die, the world holding its breath. Royce's hand wavered just for a second. It was enough. "Don't you play the righteous man with me." Royce snapped, his composure cracking. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know she said no," Calder replied, the words landing like stones. "And in my book, that matters more than your family name. Or your fancy papers." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Royce finally cursed under his breath, holstered the pistol, and snatched up the reins. He jerked the horse's head around so violently that the animal reared its front hooves, pawing at the air. "She'll regret this," he snarled over his shoulder. "And so will you." Calder didn't answer. He stood there unmoving until Royce Blackwell had vanished back into the trees. Then, and only then, did he turn toward the house. Eliza was still in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles were white. Their eyes met across the snowy yard, and without a word, Calder gave her a single sharp nod. It was a promise You're safe. For now. A week later, just past noon, Royce Blackwell returned. This time, he was not alone. He rode with two men flanking him, broad-shouldered figures with hard, vacant eyes. Behind them, a fourth man rode a fine-looking mare. He was older, dressed in a black suit that looked out of place in the Wyoming wilderness. A judge's suit. Calder stepped out from the barn as they approached the rag in his hand, stained with oil. Royce dismounted, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "I warned you I'd be back, Briggs." He gestured to the man in the black suit. "This is Judge Miller from Laramie County. He's reviewed my affidavits, testimonies from my family, my staff, all attesting to Miss Monroe's crimes." He produced another set of papers, these bearing an official-looking seal. Eliza came to stand on the porch, her spine straight, her gaze steady. "None of it is true," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Judge Miller dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look at Eliza. He addressed Calder. "Mr. Briggs, according to these sworn statements, this woman is a fugitive from justice. I have been given the authority to grant temporary guardianship to her closest living relation in the territory, which is Mr. Blackwell. He will escort her back to Kansas to face these charges." "This isn't Kansas," Calder said, his voice dangerously low. "And you're not a judge in this county." "A legal technicality," Miller said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The law is the law." Then Royce turned his attention fully to Calder, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had waited a very long time for this moment. "You still don't remember me, do you, Briggs? It's the scar, I suppose. It changes a man's face." Calder stared at him, a cold sense of dread creeping up his spine. "Think back," Royce hissed, taking a step forward. 8 years ago, a hot, dusty day in Abilene, Kansas, the Merchants' Bank. The world tilted on its axis. The smell of dust and cordite filled Calder's senses. He saw Sarah's face, Daniel's small hand in his. "My brother Silas Blackwell died in that street," Royce said, his voice dripping with venom. "The marshal got the credit, but it was you, wasn't it? The brave citizen who got in the way, who caused the chaos. My brother died because of you, and you just walked away." It all clicked into place. The fine clothes, the silver pocket watch, the unrelenting obsession. This was never about Eliza. It was about him. She was just the key, Royce admitted, his eyes glittering with manic triumph. "I heard about the scandal back home, learned she'd fled west. I followed her, and when I found out she'd ended up here with you, it was perfect. A perfect way to make you feel exactly what I felt that day. To have the one good thing that wandered into your miserable life ripped away right in front of your eyes." He pulled a small object from his pocket. It wasn't the watch this time. It was a tarnished silver locket. Calder's locket. "I picked this up from the dust next to my brother's body," Royce sneered. "A little keepsake. I imagine the woman inside was important to you." The rage that hit Calder was a white-hot, blinding force. It was the scream from 8 years ago, finally finding its voice. But before he could move, before he could tear Royce apart with his bare hands, the two hired men drew their guns. Judge Miller cleared his throat, his face a mask of false solemnity. "Mr. Blackwell has legal custody. I'm giving you 24 hours to turn her over. If you resist, you will be charged with obstructing justice. It's over, Briggs." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving Calder and Eliza standing in the sudden, deafening silence. The law was against them. The town, influenced by a judge's authority, would not help. They were utterly, completely alone. Eliza looked at Calder's face, at the raw, agonizing pain etched there, a pain that finally had a name. He wasn't just a quiet, scarred man. He was a man who had already lost everything once. And now the ghost, responsible for that loss, had returned to take the only thing he had left. The sky began to curdle that afternoon, turning a sickly yellow-gray. The wind, which had been a constant biting presence, suddenly died, leaving an eerie, oppressive stillness. The temperature plummeted. By nightfall, the world outside the windows of the ranch house had disappeared. A blizzard fiercer and more sudden than any Calder had seen in years had descended upon them, a roaring wall of white that cut them off from the world. Inside, the silence was just as suffocating. Calder had not spoken a word since Royce had left. He had methodically checked the shutters, brought in extra firewood, and secured the barn, his movements precise and mechanical. Now he sat at the kitchen table staring at the tarnished silver locket that Royce had contemptuously tossed into the dirt. Eliza sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea, watching the storm rage in his eyes. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly, the words feeling small and inadequate against the enormity of his grief. He finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "I was standing right there," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "I was holding his hand. Her back was against my chest. I was supposed to protect them." "You did," she insisted. "You shielded them with your body." What that man did, that was a dying man's last act of hate. It had nothing to do with you. He shook his head, looking back down at the locket. "He took them from me, and now he's come back for you." He closed his hand around the locket, his knuckles white. "I won't let it happen." The wind howled, rattling the window panes in their frames. The house groaned under the assault. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm's fury, a frantic whinnying from the barn, followed by a splintering crash. Calder was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the shotgun he kept mounted over the doorway. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice hard as iron. "Lock the door behind me." But Eliza was already shaking her head. "No. Whatever is out there, we face it together." He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, warring with a fierce, unyielding resolve. And he gave a single curt nod. They stepped out onto the porch and were immediately hit by a blast of wind and blinding snow. It was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They fought their way toward the barn and the source of the commotion. The main door had been torn from one of its hinges and was banging uselessly in the wind. Inside the lantern, light cast long, dancing shadows. One of the stalls was empty, its gate shattered. And standing in the middle of the barn were Royce Blackwell and his 2 hired guns, their faces grim, their coats caked with snow. Royce held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Calder. "The storm gave us perfect cover," Royce said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The judge can have his papers. I've decided I prefer a more direct approach. You'll give me the woman, and we'll disappear into the storm. By the time anyone finds you, we'll be long gone." "You'll have to kill me first," Calder said, raising the shotgun. Royce smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. That was always part of the plan. The barn exploded into a cacophony of violence. One of Royce's men lunged for Calder. Calder fired the shotgun, the blast echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. The man was thrown backward into a stack of hay bales. The second man drew his pistol and fired the bullet, splintering the wooden post just inches from Eliza's head. She screamed and ducked as Calder shoved her toward the cover of the stalls. He dropped the empty shotgun and drew the revolver from his belt, firing back. The world devolved into a chaotic blur of muzzle flashes, shouting, and the terrified screams of the animals. Calder moved with a deadly efficiency, a man with nothing left to lose. He shot the second hired man in the leg, sending him to the ground with a cry of pain. Now it was just him and Royce. They circled each other in the gloom. two ghosts of Abilene finally come to their reckoning. "This is for Silas," Royce roared, firing wildly. Calder ducked behind a water trough, a bullet whining past his ear. The sound, the smell, the adrenaline, it was all the same. The dust of Kansas had followed him here. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just a victim. This time he was fighting for something. He was fighting for the woman hiding behind the stalls, the woman who had brought light back into his empty, silent house. He saw his opening. Royce was reloading, his movements frantic. Calder burst from cover, tackling him and sending them both crashing to the dirt floor. They wrestled for the gun, grunting, their fists landing with dull, heavy thuds. Calder was stronger, his rage giving him a brutal power. He slammed Royce's head against the ground once, twice. Royce's grip on the pistol loosened. Calder wrenched it free and scrambled back, leveling the weapon at Royce's chest. Royce lay gasping on the ground, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes wide with fear. Calder's finger tightened on the trigger. Here it was. The chance to end it. The chance for a final bloody justice for Sarah and Daniel. He could pull the trigger and erase the man who had destroyed his life. He could become the monster that had haunted him for 8 years. Calder, no. Eliza's voice cut through his red haze of fury. She was standing there, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. Don't become him." He stared at her, then back at the pathetic, beaten man on the floor. He saw the locket which had fallen from his own pocket during the struggle lying in the dirt between them. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, heard Daniel's laughter. And he knew they would not have wanted this. They would not have wanted their memory to be tarnished by an act of cold-blooded vengeance. With a ragged cry that was half sob, half roar, Calder lowered the gun. He didn't fire. Instead, he swung the heavy barrel of the pistol in a vicious arc, striking Royce's hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Royce screamed in agony, his gun hand shattered. Redemption, not revenge. He had made his choice. As the first light of dawn broke, the storm finally exhausted itself. The wind died down to a whisper, revealing a world transformed, buried under a deep, pristine blanket of white. The silence that followed the blizzard was absolute. It was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Langley, his face grim, rode into the yard with a posse of 4 men. Having grown deeply suspicious of Judge Miller's convenient jurisdiction and Royce's smug certainty, he had decided to ride out as soon as the storm broke, fearing the worst. He found Royce Blackwell and his wounded man, tied up in the barn. He found Calder sitting on the porch steps, his face bruised and his hands shaking, with Eliza beside him. Gently cleaning the gash on his cheek, the old scar reopened. The silver locket lay on the step between them. Royce, his bravado shattered along with his hand, confessed everything in a torrent of angry, self-pitying rage. He told them about his brother, about his obsessive quest for revenge, about how he had paid Judge Miller a handsome sum to fabricate the legal documents. A search of the judge's saddlebags left behind at the town's hotel produced letters that confirmed the conspiracy and implicated Miller in several other land grab schemes. The law slow and imperfect, as it was finally turned on the men who had tried to corrupt it. The immediate threat was over, but the emotional storm had just begun to recede. Calder and Eliza sat on the porch watching as the sheriff led the villains away. The physical wounds would heal. The deeper ones would take more time. A few months later, when spring had finally come to the high plains, melting the last of the snow and coaxing tentative green shoots from the thirsty earth, Calder took Eliza's hand. He led her not toward the town or the barn, but up the small hill that overlooked the ranch house. The wind was gentle here, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. At the crest of the hill, under the shade of a lone, ancient pine, were 2 small, simple wooden crosses. They were weathered by years of sun and snow, but Calder had kept them clear of weeds. He had never brought anyone here before. He knelt, his hand resting on one of the crosses. "This is Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And this is our son Daniel." For the first time, he told her everything. He spoke of Sarah's laugh, of the way she would hum when she gardened. He told her about Daniel's fascination with frogs and his dream of seeing the ocean. He spoke not of their deaths, but of their lives, giving them back their color and warmth. Eliza knelt beside him, listening, her hand resting on his back, offering a silent, unwavering support. When he was finished, he took the silver locket from his pocket. He had polished it until it shone. He opened it, revealing the tiny, faded portraits of his wife and child, smiling out at a world that had been stolen from them. He looked at it for a long, silent moment, then pressed it closed. "It's time," he said softly. Together, they dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of the graves. Calder placed the locket inside a final symbolic act of letting go, not forgetting but releasing the grip the past had held on him. As they covered it with earth, a sense of peace, profound and hard-won, settled over them. They were not burying his love for his family. They were planting it, allowing it to become a part of the land, a foundation upon which a new life could be built. The following autumn, the sound of children's laughter filled the air on the outskirts of Snow Ridge. Eliza stood at the front of the town's first schoolhouse, a simple one-room building that Calder had helped build plank by plank. Children from the surrounding homesteads sat on benches he had made, their faces upturned and eager, their hands clutching new slates. She taught them letters and numbers, but more than that, she taught them that their stories mattered. From the edge of the schoolyard, Calder Briggs watched, leaning against a fence post. The lines of grief that had been carved so deeply into his face had softened. As Eliza finished a lesson and turned to smile at her students, a genuine, unburdened smile lit up her face. Watching her, a quiet smile touched Calder's own lips. The silence that had once been his prison had finally become a peaceful quiet, filled not with absence, but with the promise of a shared future. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by the love he had been fortunate enough to find again.